Hello, I'm Nate, aka B-Tier Mutineer, and in this video, part of my B-Tier Guide series for Dragon Age Origins, I'm going to take you through the combat mechanics of DAO. Even though I have build guides for the Warden and all the companions, I want to explain this general combat information for people who want to learn how the game works and make their own builds. I'm not going to go into the mathematical calculations because frankly, I'm not that good at math. If you're interested in those details, you can always go on the Dragon Age wiki and look through the combat mechanics page for Origins, which will be linked in the description. Please note that I am particularly talking about Origins itself and not including the Awakening expansion in this discussion, because Awakening has a bunch of overpowered abilities and items which make a lot of things easier for the player. If you understand how things work in Origins, you shouldn't have any trouble in Awakening. First and foremost, before we talk about anything else, I need to explain Threat. Threat is a mechanic through which enemies decide which characters in your party to attack. The threat of a character is an indication of how aggressive enemies are towards them. Enemies usually ignore characters with low threat and attack characters with high threat. It's an essential part of combat strategy in DAO, especially on higher difficulties. However, even on easy difficulty, understanding threat and manipulating it to your advantage is very important, in particular in certain fights that are designed to be more difficult, such as boss fights or optional content with good rewards that is made harder on purpose. On difficulty levels lower than Nightmare, characters wearing armors and wielding melee weapons get extra threat. The number added to their threat is 10 if they wear medium, heavy, or massive armor, and just 5 if they wear light armor. However, on Nightmare difficulty, there are no such bonuses to threat based on gear. Dealing damage to an enemy draws threat from that enemy. The amount of threat drawn is the percentage of the enemy's maximum health inflicted as damage. Rogues only draw 80% of this threat amount. This means that using damage to draw threat from boss enemies is very inefficient because they usually have thousands of health points. Against these enemies, it's much better to use abilities with high fixed threat values like a warrior's taunt talent. There's also a distance-based component to threat, which basically means that the closer one of your character is to an enemy, the higher threat level they have towards that enemy, making the enemy more likely to attack them if they're close. Most damaging talents and spells should also draw extra threat on top of the one they get from the damage they deal. However, in many cases this isn't properly implemented in the vanilla game, but if you're playing on PC, you can install the Dane's Fixes mod, which solves this alongside many other problems. Threat decreases automatically at a rate of 0.5 per second, and you also have various ways through which to decrease it more actively. The spell Mind Blast clears all threat drawn by the mage except for the distance-based component of it, which in essence just means that after you use Mind Blast when surrounded by a group of enemies, make sure your mage runs away while the enemies are stunned so that they lose interest in attacking your mage. A rogue entering stealth mode also resets their threat values, unless the stealth mode is broken within 1 to 2 seconds. Feign Death works similarly to stealth, though I've never used that talent in my life. Distraction from the Bard specialization clears all the threat of the target, except the distance-based component, just like Mind Blast. A warrior's disengage talent lowers threat by 100. The property reduces hostility found on various items is not implemented properly in the base game and doesn't actually reduce threat in any way, but the mod Dane's Fixes solves this. When a character moves more than 60 meters away from their enemies, their threat is reset as well. The most common and quite efficient strategy used by players to deal with threat is the tank and range strategy. This consists in increasing the threat of 1 or 2 warriors in your party, generally equipped with a weapon and shield. The high threat draws most enemy attacks to this warrior, who acts as a tank whose job it is to soak up damage while the other party members take care of damaging, healing, buffing, and debuffing. You can have damaging characters who attack from a range, such as archers and mages, or otherwise be careful with your melee damagers by making sure your tank keeps the enemy aggression. Now let's get into the other important stats I want to explain. I will talk about them in little groups, starting with attack, defense, and missile deflection. Each character has an attack score, which is used to determine whether a physical, aka melee or ranged attack, hits an enemy. The attack score of a character depends on their class, as well as strength, dexterity, and attack bonuses or penalties that they can get from various items or abilities. The chance that a melee attack hits its target is determined by the attack score of the attacker and the defense score of the target. If the attack score of the attacker is equal to the defense score of the defender, the chance of hitting is 54%, so it's slightly skewed towards the attacker. I believe this is mostly to help the player character earlier on in the game when their attack is quite low. Ranged attacks work in the same way, but the defender's missile deflection score is used instead of defense. For regular melee and ranged attacks, the attack bonuses are simple. Melee attacks get bonuses to attack from strength and dexterity, half and half, whereas ranged attacks only get attack bonuses from dexterity. It's a bit different for mages. A mage normally doesn't care about their attack score if they're using a magic staff, because staff basic attacks always hit, unless they get blocked by the environment. Staff attacks also never crit. However, if the mage is an arcane warrior and they are using melee weapons, their attack score becomes important. Arcane warriors use Spellpower instead of strength with the combat magic ability, though strength and dexterity still provide additional bonuses. For arcane warriors, if you want to increase something other than magic and Spellpower, I recommend putting some points in dexterity since it will affect both the attack and defense score of your character. Defense is a character's ability to avoid melee attacks entirely. The score is a combination of the character's base defense, which varies by class. Rogues have the highest, mages have the lowest, the character's dexterity, and various items, abilities, and the difficulty level. While shields contribute directly to the character's defense, armor doesn't, and instead just reduces the damage received from a successful hit. Missile Deflection, also called Defense Against Missiles, chance to avoid missile attacks, and missile avoidance on certain items, is a separate score that determines the character's ability to avoid ranged attacks from archers entirely. Shields tend to contribute more to missile deflection than defense, and some other items and abilities can increase a character's missile deflection as well. Next up, Armor and Armor Penetration. Armor reduces the physical damage received from a successful attack. It is determined by armor gear, helm, chest piece, gloves, and boots, as well as bonuses you can get from various abilities or other pieces of gear. Armor is particularly important for tank characters who draw the aggression of all the enemies and are much more likely to get hit, so it's better for them to have a higher armor score so that they take less damage from those hits. There are 4 types of armor gear: light, medium, heavy, and massive. All armor in the vanilla game has strength requirements, even light armor, with light armor having the lowest strength score required and massive armor having the highest. If you're playing on PC, however, I highly recommend using the Dexterity Light Armor mod, which changes light armor to have a dexterity requirement instead of strength, because I think it makes no sense for light armor to require strength to equip. There are also cloth robes generally used by mages, some of which can have bonuses to armor as part of their stats, but robes do not inherently have any baseline armor scores like the other armors do. Armor Penetration, often shortened to AP by players, is a stat related to melee and ranged weapons, which reduces the armor effectiveness of the weapon's target. For example, when a character uses a weapon with 5 armor penetration against an enemy with 10 armor, the weapon deals damage as if the enemy only had 5 armor, so 10 armor minus 5 armor penetration. As long as the target is wearing armor, the AP score is equivalent to extra damage. However, if the AP score is greater than the target's armor score, the excess armor penetration doesn't inflict damage. Armor penetration is capped at 41 points. It can be increased through cunning, bonuses from equipment, and various abilities. The bonuses from cunning are mostly relevant to rogues, as they are the only ones who really benefit from investing a lot of points into cunning. If you're going to take damage, you'll be losing HP, health points, and if you're using various spells or abilities, you'll be spending stamina if you're a warrior or rogue, or mana if you're a mage. Health is the total amount of damage a character can take before falling unconscious or dying. Base health and health increased per level is varied by class. The Constitution attribute will also increase a character's health by a measly 5 points per point purchased. Warriors have the highest base HP and HP increase per level up, mages have the lowest base health but average HP per level up, and rogues have average base health but the lowest HP per level up. A party member falls unconscious when their HP drops to 0 and can only be revived if the combat sequence ends with at least one party member still conscious, or if a spirit healer mage casts the revival spell on them. Characters can heal themselves with health poultices or by using magic abilities. There are a few non-mage abilities that can heal a character or greatly increase their health regeneration, as well as a few items that can increase a character's health regeneration in combat, but health poultices and healing spells are the main way to heal during combat. Out of combat, you can just sit there and wait for your character's HP to regenerate to full. Mana or stamina is the pool which allows characters to utilize abilities or spells while in combat. Warriors and rogues have stamina, and mages have mana. Base mana or stamina, as well as mana or stamina increased per level up, is varied by class just like health. The willpower attribute increases mana or stamina by 5 for each point purchased. Mages have the highest base and level up mana, whereas rogues have the lowest stamina and warriors have average stamina. There is of course also mana and stamina regeneration in combat, which can be increased through tier 2 of the combat training skill called Improved Combat Training, as well as from bonuses on some pieces of gear. There are certain types of builds which are more stamina or mana hungry than others. Mages in particular are really bad with just basic staff attacks, as those don't do much damage, so they will need to use various active and sustained spells which will eat up a lot of their mana. Though there is also the Blood Mage specialization, which grants the Blood Magic sustained ability that lets mages use their health instead of their mana to cast spells, in which case they will have less need of mana. Rogues are the least stamina dependent, since other than a handful of abilities, they want to mainly auto-attack so that they can either crit or backstab enemies. Warriors do require quite a bit of stamina to be able to keep up various sustained abilities as well as use activated abilities, and they also have a further reason to need more stamina because they tend to wear heavier armor: fatigue. Fatigue is a stat that affects a character's stamina or mana usage. It's increased by equipping armor on a character, especially heavier armor, or activating sustained abilities. Fatigue can be reduced through passive talents, modifiers or certain pieces of gear, or armor set bonuses from wearing 3 or 4 pieces that comprise a full armor set. Fatigue affects combat in 2 ways. First, it modifies the cost of activated abilities and spells, with the percentage change in cost being equal to the percentage fatigue the character has. If a character has 10% fatigue displayed in red, their abilities will cost 10% more mana or stamina. If a character has minus 10% fatigue displayed in white, their abilities will cost 10% less stamina or mana. Second, if the amount of fatigue crosses a threshold where it exceeds what would naturally be absorbed by the character, then it will decrease the available mana or stamina available for use in combat. This is called a fatigue penalty. The important thing to know about fatigue is that the armor pieces you use on your characters are what generally pushes them to have fatigue issues. Due to this, most mages should be wearing mage robes or light armor at most, the exception being arcane warriors who can wear medium or heavy armor due to the specialization allowing them to do so more easily. Rogues should wear light or medium armor, and finally, warriors can wear any type of armor all the way up to massive armor, though do note that massive armor will indeed add a lot more fatigue, and they will be able to have less sustained abilities active as well as in general use less abilities unless their stamina pool is also increased. Next up, 2 stats which can cause characters to completely avoid either attacks or spells: dodge chance and spell resistance. Dodge chance is a percentage from 0 to 100, which determines the chance for a creature to completely evade a physical attack before defense is factored in. Dodge is modified by a number of abilities, as well as the plus X% chance to dodge attacks effect from equipment. It is possible to achieve 100% chance to dodge by combining bonuses from these sources. Attacks that perform an attack roll but cannot miss, such as an archer's scattershot, cannot be dodged. You also won't be able to avoid certain enemy abilities through defense or dodge chance if they do not have an attack roll. The abilities in question are an Ogre's Ram and Grab, a Golem's Slam, a High Dragon's Grab, and the Overwhelm ability, which can be used by various beasts, dragons, and shrieks. The best thing you can do against these enemy abilities is to interrupt the effect with abilities that have animations with a higher priority, such as Knockdown, Paralyze, Root, Draining, Heavy Impact, and Fear effects. Otherwise, you can have a mage character who can cast Force Field on the ally being affected by the unavoidable attack, which will cause them to be immune to any kind of damage and thus negate it. Spell resistance is a percentage that determines the chance to completely ignore a hostile magical spell attack. Spells cast by party members that have friendly fire are not normally affected by spell resistance. It's also important to note that it only works against spells that can be cast by controllable characters. Spell resistance is not that common, as it's found on only a few items in the game, some Templar restricted armors, a few accessories, and Dwemer runes. Dwarven characters get a bonus of plus 10% spell resistance as a racial trait. It is possible to reach 100% spell resistance with warriors if they have the Templar specialization, and you can get pretty close to 100% with the other classes using various pieces of gear. However, do note that area of effect elemental damage from spells such as Fireball, Chain Lightning, etc. cannot be resisted with spell resistance. They will require elemental resistances to mitigate. Let's get into elemental damage and elemental resistances, vulnerabilities, and immunities. You can deal elemental damage of the following elements: cold, electricity, fire, nature, and spirit. These types of damage cannot be mitigated through armor. They can only be reduced or resisted through elemental resistances, or in some enemies' cases, immunities. Elemental damage can be dealt through spells and a few special abilities like the Templar's Holy Smite, weapon runes and poisons which add some points of elemental damage per hit, bombs that do AoE elemental damage, and magic staves that have an element associated with their basic attacks. You can get up to the cap of plus 30% bonus to damage with a certain element with items that have a plus X% element damage property. Usually these items are mage gloves, accessories, magic staves, and Morrigan's 2 special robes. Whereas physical damage can be mitigated with armor, elemental damage is subject to elemental resistances, which certain enemies possess innately and which characters gain through abilities, skills, or items. If a character has 10% resistance to fire, all fire damage they take is reduced by 10%. Characters can also become vulnerable to elemental damage if their resistance is reduced to negative numbers, in which case they suffer increased elemental damage of that type. The minimum possible elemental resistance is minus 100% and it's attainable with hexes. The maximum possible elemental resistance is 75%. Some creatures are completely immune to a certain type of element. Immunities cannot be bypassed with hex-type spells. Abominations, corpses, skeletons, undead-type enemies, and golems are immune to nature damage. Arcane horrors and revenants are immune to cold and nature damage. Witherfang is immune to cold damage. And finally, ash wraiths, dragon-type enemies, excluding high dragons, and rage demons are immune to fire damage. Note that cold resistance or immunity doesn't grant immunity to freezing effects, so you can still use spells like Cone of Cold on revenants or arcane horrors if you want to freeze them. Do also note that these immunities are based on the creature templates, but they can be overridden for certain creatures, so not all creatures encountered will necessarily have the immunities I mentioned, but it's still worth keeping these in mind. No enemies are immune to spirit or electricity damage, which makes them good damage types to have. Nature, on the other hand, is the most commonly resisted, and lots of enemies are completely immune to it. Fire damage is frequently resisted, and a few enemies are immune to it, but it's still a worthwhile damage type to use because Darkspawn and Undead type enemies are weak to fire. I myself tend to use fire and lightning as the main elements, as well as spirit damage wherever I can, from a few mage spells mostly. Of course, considering the fact that enemies can have various resistances to elements, it's always great to have a good physical damage dealer in your party as well, especially one with high armor penetration. For my party, I've found elemental resistances to be something I only use in special circumstances when I'm fighting a big strong boss which does a lot of a particular type of damage, such as a high dragon dealing a lot of fire damage with its breath, or the archdemon having abilities that deal a lot of spirit damage. In these special cases, it's nice to have gear with elemental resistances if the gear is also generally pretty good. Otherwise, you can keep some consumables which will increase a character's resistance to a certain element. Warmth bombs provide fire resistance, and spirit bombs provide spirit resistance. I haven't really needed to use the other types of bombs or salves myself, though perhaps a nature salve might be useful against enemies that have various poisonous or venomous effects like certain spiders or deep stalkers with their nature damage dealing poison or acid spit. Of course, if you're playing on a lower difficulty, I don't think you need to care that much about elemental resistances and consumables since you'll be taking less damage from these boss abilities. Still, it's something to consider in case you're having trouble with any such enemies. There are two final resistances to talk about, physical and mental resistance. They are specifically related to talents and spells that call for the target to do a resistance check to withstand a physical or mental combat effect. There are only 12 abilities which call for mental resistance checks, and 40-something abilities which call for physical resistance checks. So, someone forgot to balance the usefulness of these stats. Resistance checks usually call for one of these two stats to be compared with one of the attacker's stats. For a spell, it will be the attacking mage's spellpower. For non-magic talents, it will usually be strength, or in some cases the cunning or willpower attributes. Physical resistance determines the character's ability to withstand combat or magic abilities which affect the body of the character, things like being frozen, knocked down, stunned, or paralyzed. If the physical resistance score is higher, the status effect does not apply, or in some cases it's replaced by a less severe effect. Physical resistance is equal to half of the combined modifiers, aka points above 10, of the character's strength, dexterity, and constitution attributes, plus or minus bonuses or penalties to physical resistance. Mental resistance, on the other hand, relates to a character resisting effects such as sleep, fear, sometimes stun, as well as a few other debuffs. Similarly to physical resistance checks, it compares one of the attacker's relevant stats against the defender's mental resistance score. It functions the same way as the physical resistance check, depending on the specific wording of the ability or spell. Mental resistance is equal to half of the combined modifiers of the character's willpower, magic, and cunning attributes, plus or minus bonuses or penalties to mental resistance. Next up, critical damage and critical chance. I will also discuss backstabs, which are a rogue-only feature. As in many other RPGs, melee and ranged attacks have a chance to become a critical hit, and thus deal increased damage. Critical hits deal 50% extra damage compared to regular hits. Spells and basic attacks from magic staves unfortunately cannot deal critical damage. In order to increase the odds of dealing a critical hit, you need to increase the stat called critical chance, a percentage that determines whether your attack is a normal or critical hit. This is a stat that is not very easy to increase since it's quite powerful, but you can improve it through a few warrior or rogue talents, as well as a couple of weapon-related talents from the dual weapon tree and the archery tree. There are also some pieces of gear which can increase your melee or ranged critical chance, but only by a few points each. Backstabs are a special type of melee attack that also deals 50% extra damage, similar to a critical hit. However, they are only available to rogues. For backstabs to occur, your rogue has to flank the target and use melee auto attacks, or once you unlock the passive ability Coup de Grace, you can cause backstab hits on stunned or paralyzed targets as well. You can increase the damage of backstabs and critical hits through items that have the plus X% backstab/critical damage. A big difference between crits and backstabs is that crits can shatter frozen or petrified enemies, whereas backstabs can't. In my opinion, it's much easier to set up your dual-wielding rogue character to backstab enemies rather than try to increase your critical chance, and backstabs get the same damage bonus as critical hits. So I recommend focusing on helping your melee rogues backstab more often through the use of paralyze runes in their weapons, as well as various ally talents and spells which can either stun or paralyze targets. For archers and warrior melee damagers, it's useful to invest in critical chance since they don't have access to backstabs, though you may also want to consider focusing on increasing your character's regular damage instead, as there are lots of weapons that do much more damage baseline while not having bonuses to crit chance or crit damage. Personally, for non-rogue characters, I just tend to increase my character's base damage since it's more reliable than critting. If for some reason you really want to deal a critical hit, such as in the case of trying to shatter an enemy, there are various talents which become a critical hit either if the attack succeeds or if some other requirement is met. There are such abilities in every weapon style tree, though the weapon and shield tree only has one. Overpower. The archery and two-handed trees have two each, critical shot and arrow of slaying for archery, and critical strike and mighty blow for two-handed. The dual weapon tree has three such abilities, riposte, cripple, and punisher. Since we're on the topic of rogue-related abilities, stealth is a talent available to rogues that prevents others from seeing them. When not in combat, rogues can activate stealth at any time. In combat, they can enter stealth if there is no perceivable enemy within 30 meters, or if they have the third rank of stealth called combat stealth, and the perception rank of all enemies within 30 meters is lower than their stealth rank. If the rogue initiates combat while stealthed, their first strike is an automatic critical hit or backstab. Outside of combat, stealth can help the rogue have a higher chance of succeeding at using the stealing skill on an NPC. I personally don't use stealth because that's a bit too much micromanagement for me, and I think that if you have enough ways to ensure either critical hits or backstabs on enemies, you don't really need to do the whole attacking from stealth thing. Sadly, even if you have a high rank in stealth and enemies don't perceive you, if you are near them, you will be in combat mode, which blocks you from exiting an area. So if you had any plans of mostly taking a stealth route through the game and killing as few enemies as possible, don't bother. Believe me, I tried because I was curious if it could be done, and was very disappointed to find out there are very few enemy encounters you can bypass with stealth. Next, let's talk about attack speed and movement speed. For melee and ranged characters, you'll notice that various weapons have different attack speeds. For melee weapons, daggers are the fastest, whereas two-handed battle axes are the slowest. For ranged weapons, short bows are the fastest, whereas crossbows are the slowest. Obviously, the faster your character attacks, the more damage they can do to enemies, so a higher attack speed is often better. However, that doesn't necessarily mean you have to choose the fastest attacking weapon. There are certain abilities, spells, and items which can increase your character's attack speed. For dual wielders, the momentum sustained ability increases their attack speed. For archers, the rapid shot sustained does the same, however, it also removes their ability to deal critical hits. Weapon and shield and two-handed warriors unfortunately do not have any talents that increase their attack speed, which sucks, seeing as their weapons attack the slowest. They have to rely either on swift salve consumables or on a mage in their party casting the haste spell, which increases the attack speed and movement speed of all party members. Archers can also increase their aiming speed with items that have the rapid aim property, mostly bows, though there is also a pair of gloves and a helmet with rapid aim bonuses. Do note that in the vanilla game there is a bug if you use both haste as well as one of the bigger attack speed bonuses. If the attack speed increases by too much, it will reset back to 0, actually causing your character to attack slower than if they were just using one of the bonuses. However, this issue and many others are fixed with the mod Dane's Fixes, which I basically recommend in every Dragon Age Origins video I make. If you're playing on PC, Dane's Fixes is a must-have. Movement speed is quite relevant in some situations, even though it's not that easy to increase. You will be mostly moving at regular speed unless you are using a swift salve consumable or the haste spell. However, even your base speed is faster than some enemies, such as the Darkspawn Ogre, which can come in handy if you're getting destroyed by ogres in the early game. Your tank or whoever is being targeted by the ogre can run around, while your other characters can do damage from a range. There are also various talents and spells which can slow targets, inflicting a penalty to their movement speed for a time. Slowing enemies can be very useful, especially if you're trying to run and get some distance from them, but I will say that there are much stronger status effects you can inflict. Let's talk about status effects, also sometimes called CC, short for crowd control. These are various effects which can be inflicted upon characters, allies, or enemies, and which hinder or incapacitate them in some way. Weaker status effects are things like slow or knockback. Stronger status effects are things that incapacitate or immobilize a character, such as stun, sleep, freeze, petrify, paralyze, or knockdown. You can inflict some of these effects with talents, spells, as well as attacks with certain weapons. A weapon with paralyze runes can inflict paralysis upon an enemy, and the Nut Crusher Maul has a chance to stun enemies with each auto attack, for example. Other effects such as sleep, petrify, or freeze in particular can only be inflicted by spells. Abilities or spells that can inflict status effects on multiple enemies at the same time are even better than single target abilities in many cases, as you will often be fighting multiple enemies and are in danger of being swarmed or overwhelmed by their numbers unless you can do something to stop or at least slow down some of them from attacking you. These multi-target abilities are what is generally meant by crowd control, since you are controlling a crowd of targets, not just a single target, though many people use CC to simply refer to applying one of these status effects even to a single enemy. I've mentioned shattering earlier, and now that I've talked about status effects, it's the perfect time to talk about combos. In Dragon Age, there are various powerful combinations of abilities and spells that have debilitating effects. Shattering is one such combo, which requires a target which is either frozen or petrified by a spell to be struck or shot with a critical hit, or have the spell's Stone Fist or Crushing Prison used on them. Boss enemies, the ones with orange names, are immune to being shattered. There are other spell combinations, which you can discover by trying to combine them yourself, though I have to admit I wouldn't have thought of most of them myself. I won't discuss them all here, just know that you can find them on the Dragon Age wiki if you're curious on the spell combinations page. A really cool and evocative spell combination that I'll leave you with is Nightmare, which you can inflict upon an enemy by casting Sleep and Horror on them, dealing a large amount of spirit damage instantly, removing the sleep effect and applying the horror effect. While there are 10 specific spell combinations that devs coded into the game, that doesn't mean you can't combine other spells or abilities in advantageous ways. For example, you may want to cast Cone of Cold to freeze enemies in an area and then cast another area of effect spell, like Blizzard or Tempest since they're stuck there. Or simply use spells or abilities that stun or paralyze enemies so that your melee rogue can more easily backstab them. It doesn't all have to be flashy or special to be good. I've left the attributes for later because attributes increase various stats that I've explained this whole time, and I think it's much better for you to understand what attack, defense, and everything else is when I tell you what a character's attributes do and which attributes are important for which class. There are 6 attributes: Strength, Dexterity, Willpower, Magic, Cunning, and Constitution. Strength increases damage from all weapons except magic staves and crossbows. It increases a character's melee attack score and physical resistance by 0.5 per point above 10. It's a prerequisite for many weapon talents and a prerequisite for equipping higher level armor and weapons. It increases intimidation effectiveness, and it's also needed by rogues for combat reasons if they do not have the lethality passive, which allows them to use cunning instead of strength as a damage modifier. In my opinion, it's a bit too important, which is why I advocate for using mods like Dexterity Light Armor, because in the vanilla game, I think too many things require strength or are improved by it. Dexterity increases melee attack score and physical resistance by 0.5, and ranged attack score and defense by 1 per point above 10. It increases damage from piercing weapons, it's a prerequisite for some weapon talents, dual wielding, archery, and shield talents, and is also a prerequisite to equip bows and daggers. I think Dexterity is also a very powerful stat because it increases both attack and defense. Willpower increases mana or stamina by 5 per point above 10, and mental resistance by 0.5 per point above 10. Together with Constitution, it's among the least useful stats, though for resource-hungry builds you will likely need to put at least a few points into Willpower, or at least get some bonuses to stamina, mana, or willpower from gear. Magic is the most important stat for mages, as it increases spell power by 1 per each point above 10. It's a prerequisite for higher level staves and many spells. It also increases mental resistance by 0.5 per point above 10, and increases the effectiveness of potions, poultices, and staves. While people tend to only put points in magic for their mage characters, I'll let you in on a little tech choice I like to make for my non-mage characters a little later. Cunning is usually a very important stat for rogues, as it increases the effectiveness of many rogue talents and increases armor penetration by 0.14 per point above 10. It's a prerequisite for many skills. It increases persuasion and lockpicking effectiveness, increases mental resistance by 0.5 per point above 10. In some cases, having a higher cunning score can also open up special dialogue options. Finally, Constitution increases health by 5 and physical resistance by 0.5 per point above 10. For Shale, it's a prerequisite for large crystals, which makes it important for her at least, since for most other characters, Constitution is essentially useless, at least when choosing which attributes to put points into during a level up. The plus 5 to health is laughable, and the extra physical resistance doesn't matter that much since you can get it from investing into strength and dexterity as well, while also likely improving your character's damage and defenses. The general advice I give to people about attributes without going into too much detail is, for warriors, mainly focus on strength with dexterity as a secondary focus, and also put a few points into willpower, and be on the lookout for some gear with stamina or willpower bonuses. Do note that your warriors are much more likely to get hit, so even though I don't necessarily recommend putting points into Constitution, I recommend equipping gear that gives them bonuses to either health or Constitution. If you feel that your warriors take a bit too much damage, try to improve their armor and other defensive stats, and keep their health topped up by casting healing spells on them with your mage or having the warriors use healing poultices. Personally, I mainly use the cheapest healing poultices since you can very easily make a lot of them without spending a lot of coin. You'll see that even these cheap poultices can heal your characters quite a bit with my special tech regarding the magic attribute that I'll explain a bit later. For rogues, mainly focus on dexterity and cunning, with perhaps some points invested in strength if you need it to equip higher tier light armors. For mages, mainly focus on magic with willpower as a secondary focus. Other people will tell you to just put all your points into magic, ignore willpower, and just chug as many Lyrium potions as you can during a fight. Personally, I think that if you aren't using some exploit to make infinite money, using so many Lyrium potions can get very expensive and annoying. So I would much rather get my mage's willpower up to something like 25, as well as get various bonuses to willpower, mana, and mana regeneration on gear if I can, so that I don't have to use a shit ton of Lyrium potions in every fight. Boss fights or longer fights will of course require a few Lyrium potions, but that's different from having to chug Lyrium in every fight. Now, I promised to share my secret regarding the magic attribute. Early on when I was playing the game, I followed the rule that people told me, which is that other than mages, no one really needs to increase their magic attribute. However, I noticed that my lesser health poultices, the cheapest and easiest to craft, were healing my warrior and rogue characters for not that much, whereas my mages got a lot of healing whenever they drank one. This made me read the magic attribute description more closely, and lo and behold, it says right there that it increases the effectiveness of potions and poultices. The thing is, you don't even need to put a lot of points into a character's magic attribute to notice the difference. Usually, a warrior or rogue will have 10 to 12 magic depending on their race. If you bump up their magic by just a few points from 10 to 13 or 12 to 15, you'll see that even those lesser health poultices can heal your character for much more than they used to. Not only that, but even your mage's healing spells will be more effective on characters that have a higher magic score. So I recommend bumping up your non-mage character's magic by 3 to 5 points. I promise it will make a difference. One other thing to discuss about magic is the stat that it increases for mages, Spellpower. Spellpower is the stat that determines the effectiveness of many mage spells. Only mages have it, and it increases by 1 point for every point above 10 you put into magic. There are other ways of increasing spell power, such as getting bonuses to it from gear or passive abilities, and activating sustained mage abilities that increase your spell power, Spell Wisp and Spell Might. For mages, increasing magic spell power as well as their mana pool and mana regeneration are the most important things. Most mages are going to stand back and fling spells from afar, so they shouldn't be targeted by enemies if the tank in your party is doing a good job of drawing enemy aggression by manipulating threat, so they can go all in on empowering their spells with higher spell power. These are pretty much all the combat mechanics and stats you need to know to have a good understanding of how combat works in Dragon Age Origins. There are various other stats you can get on gear and such, but they aren't as important as the stats and details I've talked about here. I know it's a lot to take in all at once, so I really recommend going into the game yourself and interacting with these systems on easy difficulty at first to get a feel for how it all works. Most of the information I've given you is stuff you can find out in the game yourself, either through reading descriptions, tutorials, codex entries related to gameplay, and even some of the loading screen tips can be helpful at times. Dragon Age Origins can feel a bit overwhelming for newer players because it doesn't do a great job of teaching the player its mechanics, and I also think it's not the most well-balanced game in terms of combat. But that's exactly why I think playing on easy for your first playthrough, or at least for the first few hours, is a good idea. The game can challenge you even on easy, and your party can absolutely die. All that the difficulty settings do is determine the damage and defenses of your party members and those of enemies. Enemies still have powerful abilities, and they are still just as numerous on all difficulty settings. So don't think that playing on easy is something of a cheaper experience of the combat. In any case, I hope you found this guide to Dragon Age Origins combat mechanics useful. It was very fun for me to make. I always enjoy reading up on the details of my favorite game. I'm also thinking about making some more videos about the various abilities available for each class, explaining the usefulness and possible cases in which you'd want to take an ability. Let me know if you'd like to see such class overviews for DAO, and I'll bump them up the list if you do. Until then, if you're looking forward to seeing more of my Dragon Age and RPG videos, do remember to subscribe and leave a like and comment while you're at it too. They really help. This has been B Tier Mutineer. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.